Welcome everyone to our new series, Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We began last week the book of Joshua, the book of Yehoshua. And we got through the first two chapters, and we will be continuing tonight. One thing I did not mention last week, and I think it's important, is the source that I'm using for these teachings. And that is called the Ma'am Lo'ez. Ma'am Lo'ez literally means from a people with a foreign tongue. It actually appears in Hallel, this name, Ma'am Lo'ez, for a people with like a different kind of language. So this book, it was written originally in Ladino. Ladino was the Sephardi equivalent of Yiddish. In other words, Yiddish is a combination of Hebrew and German, and then it morphed into Yiddish. So by the Sephardim, they had a similar thing between Spanish and Hebrew, and it was called Ladino. It is not used that much right now, but the Jews of Spain at one point were one of the greatest Jewish communities in the world. And after the expulsion in 1492, Jews scattered all over, and many of them ended up in the Ottoman Empire, especially in Turkey. And one of them, his name was Rabbi Yaakov Kuli. They spell it in English, C-U-L-I. And in 1730, in Turkey, he looked around and he saw that many people didn't really know the Jewish traditions sufficiently. And so he took it upon himself, starting with Bereshit, starting with Genesis. He was going to go through not only the 5 books of Moshe, the Chumash, but he was going to continue through the prophets. And it was a monumental task. And he called it Ma'am Lo'ez, because again, it was written in Ladino, because he wanted the people to understand it. Just like in ancient Israel, Aramaic was this, for a while at least, was the spoken language of most people. And so to this day, we have many prayers in Aramaic, especially Kaddish. Kaddish is in Aramaic. Kol Nidre is in Aramaic. And most of the Talmud is in either Aramaic and Hebrew. So in 1730, he began this monumental task. And in truth, he only lived a few years after that. He completed Bereshit and 2/3 of Shemot. And then he passed away. But already people saw he took sources from everywhere. And people saw like this is such a tremendous thing. And he wrote in a very simple language. He wanted everyone to be able to understand the traditions. And so over the years, really a host of rabbis continued this series called the Ma'am Lo'ez. In our day, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan took it upon himself to translate, at a certain point, it was translated into Hebrew, from Ladino into Hebrew. And Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who was a prolific writer, he published, you can see on Amazon, the entire Ma'am Lo'ez in English. So I am using the Hebrew translation of the Ladino for my sources. And so he sources everything. But instead of people having to look in like 30 different sources, and people wouldn't even know where to look. He brought it all together. And so that's the source that I'm using to prepare these classes. And we're just starting. We have all the prophets to do. So I just wanted everyone to know where I'm getting my information from, not just reading the simple storyline of Joshua, because it's very similar to the Torah. Without the oral traditions, a lot of it is like we don't quite grasp. It turns out that the book of Yehoshua is pretty straightforward, but there's so much between the lines. And that's where I'm trying to give over what's between the lines, because everyone could open up a Tanakh and read it in Hebrew or English. But here we're trying to go a little bit deeper. So starting in chapter 3, we see the preparations for crossing the Jordan River. I mentioned already that God comes to Yehoshua on the 7th of Nisan, meaning a week before Pesach, and they're camped right across from Jericho on the other side of the Jordan River. And on the 7th of Nisan, God comes to Yehoshua and says, tell the people to prepare for 3 days, because in 3 days, you will cross the Jordan, and after 40 years of wandering in the desert, you will enter into Eretz Yisrael. And in the 3rd chapter, and I'll remind everyone, we're not going verse by verse. I will point out important verses. I'm giving like more of a review. Is most of the 3rd and 4th chapters is about crossing the Jordan River. And so before we get into the details, we want to understand the context of the importance of crossing the Jordan. We see 4 different times in Jewish history where tremendous transitions occur through crossing through water. The first one is when Avram leaves Ur Kasdim. That was the song we just heard, that God took Avram out of Ur Kasdim and brought him to Israel. But in order to do that, he had to cross the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River then, and we could even say even now, is one of the greatest rivers in the world. But in the ancient times, it was a clear demarcation between what we'll call east and west. East of the river, Euphrates, was east, and west of there is what we would call now west. And Avram crosses the Euphrates, and he is called in the Torah Avram HaIvri, Avram the Hebrew. Well, the word Hebrew, Ivri, comes from the word over, which means to cross over, to transverse, to go beyond. And so the Midrash says, it's not just that Avram left Ur Kasdim and crossed the Euphrates to go to Israel. The Midrash says that Avram stood on one side of the world and the whole rest of the world was on the other side, because Avram is called the father of monotheism. And so Avram, already in Ur Kasdim, was teaching about one God. He was thrown in a fiery furnace for his belief in one God. And so until actually the book of Esther, we're called Hebrews over this idea of Avram crossing over like a demarcation, not only physically, but spiritually. The second time is when Yaakov fights with the angel, and he receives the name Yisrael. But to get to where the fight was, it says that he crossed over Ma'avar Yabok, the Yabok stream. And again, he went from being, before he crossed over, he's Yaakov. A few hours later, he becomes Yisrael. It's obviously a major transformation in not just the life of Yaakov, in the whole history of the Jewish people. But again, it's accomplished through crossing over water. When we leave Egypt, so we had to go through the sea. And there was, of course, a tremendous miracle, and the sea split, and we went through, and we have the Song of the Sea that's included in our prayers every day. But that is the transition from slavery to freedom. But again, it happens through crossing through water. And here, the fourth time is for us to enter Eretz Yisrael, we have to cross the Jordan River. So that's a very, very important context to understand not just the physical crossing the Jordan River, you have to. The Jordan River divides between what today we would call Jordan, or actually Syria and Jordan. You have to cross it to get into Israel. But here we're talking spiritually, that this theme repeats itself over and over again. So the third and fourth chapter in the book of Joshua, God is giving over directions to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua is giving it over to the people. Again, on the 7th of Nisan, God tells Yehoshua to tell the people, get prepared. And then God explains to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua explains to the people, how are they going to cross the Jordan? So there wasn't a bridge, and they didn't wade through. And actually, it makes a point in the third chapter that in the spring, and I've seen this myself, the Jordan River is one of the most famous rivers in the world. But a lot of people, when you get to the Jordan, they all kinds of songs about the Jordan River and gospel songs about the Jordan River. You get there and it's like, this is it? It's really a relatively small river. So I'll mention Colorado. Again, I'm looking right at Scott. There's probably, I'm just guessing, probably 1,000 rivers in Colorado alone that would dwarf the Jordan River. Minnesota is 10,000 lakes. So a lot of people get to the Jordan, it's like, this is it. But it points out in the spring, parts of the Jordan can be like a raging river because all the snow is melting from the Mount Hermon. And it actually, it mentions in Yehoshua that in the spring it flows over the banks. It can be, if there's a lot of snow that year, it can flood over the banks. So crossing the Jordan River in the spring, they couldn't wade through. There was no way they could wade through. And so the Gemara discusses this, that, and God says, here's the procedure. That, and I do have to mention something for those who are following and reading this in Hebrew or English. And I'm not going to get into all of the details, but here, this is like one of the places, the Mamlo is, when you read this, sometimes you get the feeling like, is this in the proper order? And the Mamloes points out that sometimes, like a sentence that will appear, let's say in chapter 4, we would have expected it already to be in chapter 3. And other things are what's called ein mukdam v'muchar b'Torah. There's no an absolute chronological storyline in the 5 books, and also here. So I'm just summarizing that the idea would be that the Kohanim would take the Holy Ark, and when they would get to the Jordan, and all of the people were behind them, and when the Kohanim would put their feet into the water, just their feet, and this is really an important point, it's not like the Jordan split. That's like the Reed Sea. Because the sea, it wasn't flowing. Here, the Jordan is like I said, it could be a raging river in the spring. So it's not like it split. What happened in the Talmud, and we have to take this with a grain of salt, but the text makes very, very clear that the water was not split, but it became like a wall. As soon as the Kohanim, who were carrying the Holy Ark, put their feet in the water came up to where the Kohanim were, and then like a wall of water started to ascend. And the sages come up with astronomical heights that this wall of water reached. And what happened is, because it was the Holy Ark, that the people were 2,000 approximately 3,000 feet behind, or we'll say, I'm not sure with a kilometer what that would be, but it was a good half mile to 3/4 of a mile behind until the water started ascending. And then once that happened, all of Israel crossed the Jordan, and the Kohanim were standing in the water where the water was with the Holy Ark. And everyone crosses through. And part of this whole procedure, and again, it's not so easy when you read the text to understand exactly the order, but God says to Yehoshua, pick 12 men, one from each tribe, and when they are crossing the Jordan, each one of them should take a huge stone. This also was quite miraculous, and put it on their shoulder and carry it to the place that they would camp that evening. And that place was called Gilgal. This is a very, very famous place in the Tanakh, Gilgal, which is right across from Jericho. And so they took these 12 stones, and so God said this was obviously a miracle. In the Gemara, they say that the miracles of crossing the Jordan River were even greater than crossing the Reed Sea. This idea of this wall of water, which we can hardly even imagine what it's describing here. It's like, supernatural or miraculous is like a tame word for what might have caused this to happen. Nonetheless, this is what happened. And they all crossed the river. And it points out, as we did before last week, it was on the 10th of Nisan. Remember, on the 7th of Nisan, God says, prepare for 3 days. They cross on the 10th of Nisan, and we mentioned last week, the 10th of Nisan is the first Shabbat HaGadol, when in Egypt, we took a lamb into our house, And that was the lamb that we slaughtered and put the blood above the doorpost and the lintel. And that was the first Korban Pesach, that lamb which was taken on the 10th of Nisan. So here, the instructions to leave Egypt were on the 10th of Nisan. And here 40 years later, we're crossing into Israel on the 10th of Nisan. And then God commands Yehoshua also to do something, and that is for Yehoshua to lift up 12 stones in. Now here it's dry land now because the water had stopped flowing. And God said, stand up 12 stones in the riverbed itself. And here, these 12 stones and the 12 stones that were taken to Gilgal. So in both cases, God says that in the future, and this is very, very similar to a number of times in the Chumash, and this is the basis of the 4 questions that are asked at the Haggadah. And it's based on the idea that in the future, when your children ask you, what are you doing? What is the Seder of Pesach? And then each of the 4 children, one of them didn't know how to ask, but there are 4 answers that are given to the children, and they're all based on verses in the Torah itself. And here we see a similar idea where God says that the reason I'm telling you to establish these 12 stones in the Jordan River itself and in this place called Gilgal is so that in the future, when your children see these 12 stones and they ask, well, what are these 12 stones? You'll tell them the story of how we crossed the Jordan River and that these 12 stones are an everlasting remembrance of this event. Now, the truth is, we don't know where these stones are now. We don't have like a monument that you can go as a tourist, which will say, here are the 12 stones. But nonetheless, it's recorded here, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that in the future, archaeological finds will find these stones. It's not out of the realm of possibility whatsoever. So this is the 3rd and 4th chapters. So that is pretty much a review. Now I want to go a little bit deeper, though. That's like the storyline. And so the Mamloez points out that it's usually the Levim who carry the Holy Ark. When the Mishkan, when the cloud of glory was in its place, and the Mishkan could be there for a day, a week, a month, a year, but when the cloud would move, then it was time to break camp. And in the book of Vayikra, there's and Bamidbar, there's very clear instructions how to break down the Mishkan and how to carry it through the desert. And it was the Levim who carried the Aron Kodesh from place to place. And so the Mamloes points out that there is only 3 times in history that the Kohanim carried the Aron. There were 2 staves at a place for 4 people to carry the Aron. So here is actually the first time that the Kohanim were appointed to carry the Holy Ark. The second time, and we're going to get to it maybe even tonight, is when we surrounded Jericho for 7 days. We're going to get to that. Again, the Kohanim were instructed they would be the ones to carry the Holy Ark around. And the third time was when Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, dedicated the first temple. And there too, the Kohanim were privileged with carrying the Ark during that process of inaugurating the temple. So here, when you read it, that the Kohanim are carrying the Aron, it was a very unusual event in Jewish history. So now, in the third chapter, I want to read the 7th verse. This is a very, very important one. So, Vayomer Hashem el Yehoshua. So God says to Yehoshua, Hayom hazeh achel gadlecha be'enei kol Yisrael. On this day, this is the day that they're going to cross the Jordan, I will make your name great in the eyes of all of Israel. Asher yedun ki ka'asher hayiti im Moshe ehyeh imach. So they will know that just like I was with Moshe, I will be with you. So this is very important. Last week, we talked extensively about the transition from Moshe to Yehoshua as the leader. And here, God is, in a certain way, helping Yeshua out, because you can imagine, Moshe has been leading the people for 40 years. They don't know really another leader. And here's Yeshua just a month after Moshe passes away. Now Yeshua is going to lead us into Eretz Yisrael and the whole task of conquering Eretz Yisrael. So here God comes and he's alluding to the fact that a good part of this miracle that's going to happen with crossing the Jordan is I'm going to help you be established in the eyes of all of Israel, that I will be with you just like I was with Moshe. So this is a very, very, very important idea here, is that, and we see from the rest of the book of Joshua, the people had total trust in Joshua, that once they crossed the Jordan River, he was established as God is in touch with him, God is revealing to him, and he knows how to lead. He knows what to do. So that verse is a very, very important verse. And then in the 4th chapter, this is something we mentioned last week already. If you remember that Joshua reminded the 2.5 tribes that had wanted to settle on the other side of the Jordan. And this is at the time of when Moshe was the leader. And Moshe said, you're going to stay on the other side of the Jordan while your families, all of Israel, crosses over and has to conquer the land, and you're going to stay there. And he worked out with them that they agreed and promised that they would go with all of Israel and fight the wars of conquering Eretz Yisrael. And then they would return to the other side of the Jordan. And as we mentioned, as we mentioned last week, even in the Balfour Declaration in 1920, England's original intent that the homeland of the Jewish people would include what we call Israel today, and the entire country of Jordan would have been included in what was Israel. So here, as they're crossing the Jordan, so Yehoshua tells these call them foot soldiers, and it mentions the number. There were 40,000 soldiers, we'll call them soldiers, from these 2.5 tribes that they crossed over first. in order to emphasize this promise that they had made. So they were the first to actually cross over. Now, going back to this verse that we just read, the 7th verse of the 3rd chapter, so this is very similar to once we crossed the Reed Sea. Before we began to sing the song, and again, this is included in our prayers every day. So it says that after this tremendous miracle of crossing the Reed Sea, it says, V'yaminu b'Hashem u'Moshe avdo. And the people believed in Hashem. They saw this tremendous miracle, and in Moshe, his servant. Meaning, very similar, that the miracle of crossing the Reed Sea, you have to remember, Moshe came back to Egypt like as a stranger, with telling them, God has appointed me to bring you out of Egypt. And then the 10 plagues started. And so it was a process of Moshe becoming the leader of all of Israel. He was missing from the scene for 40 years. And so when we crossed the Reed Sea, so it says, and the people believed in Hashem and in Moshe, his servant. And that's very similar to what we just read here, that God says to Yehoshua, today I will make your name great in the eyes of all of Israel. And so it's a very similar process of, in a certain way, God helping out, because Moshe was God's appointed leader and Yehoshua was God's appointed leader. Because when God told Moshe, you will not be able to bring the people into Israel. So Moshe said, we can't have a flock with no leader. And God said, choose Yehoshua. So it's God who chose Yehoshua. But again, the people had to believe this, had to have confidence in this. Okay, now we're going to the 5th chapter. The 5th chapter. And here we've crossed the Jordan. The 3rd and 4th chapter is the whole process of crossing the Jordan. And as I said, in the Gemara, they talk about that the miracles of crossing the Jordan were even greater than the splitting of the Red Sea. And there's a lot written. Some is, I think, in Sanhedrin, in Sota, different parts of the story. But it was considered a tremendous miracle. In the 5th chapter, they've now crossed over, and they're camped in Gilgal. That is where these 12 stones were set up. And it is now the 11th of Nisan. And God commands Yehoshua to circumcise everyone who needed to be circumcised on the 11th of Nisan. So the question is, well, why did he have to do this? Why did he have to circumcise everyone? Wasn't everyone circumcised as they were born on the 8th day? So we're told in tradition that it actually wasn't like this. That before we came out of Egypt, this goes back to the preparation for coming out of Egypt, is all the men who needed to be circumcised were circumcised, because one of the laws of the Paschal offering is you have to be circumcised to be able to eat from it. But this goes back 40 years. So it's pointed out that during the 40 years in the desert, none of the babies were circumcised. So the question is, well, why not? This is such an important mitzvah. And so the answer was that because the context of the 40 years in the desert, and we know from the Parsha Maseh, there were 42 journeys during those 40 years. And it points out some they were in a place for a matter of days. And then the cloud would move, and they just set up camp. They would have to break camp and move again. Sometimes they'd be in a place for a month or a year. One of the places, Kadesh Barnea, they were there for 19 years. But they never knew, there was no pre-warning. It wasn't like God said to Moshe, you'll be in Kadesh Barnea for 19 years. Part of the whole experience in the desert, and we're going to see the connection very soon, is the same teaching of the manna, the man from heaven, the bread from heaven, is it came every day, and you couldn't save it. If you took more than your portion for your family or per person, it would rot. And this engendered a trust in God that God would provide every day. And so the same thing, they never knew how long they would be in a place. And so circumcision it's an operation. It's an 8-year-old child. And if a child is circumcised, and then you have to break camp and travel, and maybe there'll be a sandstorm or this or that, it could be very, very dangerous to a 8-year-old child. So amazingly enough, during the whole 40 years, no circumcision was done in the desert. And so that's why the beginning of the 5th chapter is that God commands Yehoshua to circumcise literally like hundreds of thousands of people. And this was all accomplished on the 11th of Nisan. And we're told that the whole thing is we're told that it's an operation, but the first 3 days after is the most, we'll call it dangerous, the most possibility of something going wrong. And this takes us back to not this week's Parsha, Lech Lecha, next week's Parsha. At the end of Lech Lecha, Avraham, who's 99 years old at that point, circumcises himself. And the beginning of Parshat Vayera is that God appears to Avram on the 3rd day after the circumcision. And Rashi explains that the 3rd day is the most painful. It can be the most painful. And God, as it were, visited Avram, who was in the category of being sick. So here, it's the 11th of Nisan. And as we're going to see, on the 14th, they brought the Korban Pesach. And they kept Pesach. But they had to be circumcised, or they wouldn't have been able to eat from the Korban Pesach. And so in the 5th chapter, the first 12 verses is about their being circumcised, and they're keeping that Pesach. And here's an interesting one. The 3rd verse says, V'yaslo Yehoshua charavot surim, and that Yehoshua made flint like knives, like for a circumcision. V'yamal et b'nei Yisrael, and he circumcised Israel. El Givat Arolot, and the place that they did this was called like the hill of foreskins. In other words, so many people were circumcised in this day that whether metaphorically or physically, there was like a mountain of foreskins on that day. So that's just like, it's just like an incredible image, an incredible image. And it explains that all of the people all the men between 20 and 60 had died. It was a new generation. And that's why that so many circumcisions had to be done, because all of the new generation had not been circumcised. Okay, so then in the 11th verse, so it says like this. No, actually, I'm going back to the 10th. It says, V'yachanu b'nei Yisrael b'Gilgal. Remember, they're in the same place across from Jericho. But here, they're in Israel now. They're in Israel, but they're still like across from Jericho. One second. V'yas et Pesach ba'arba yom l'chodesh be'erev be'aravot Yericho. And so on the 14th, Pesach is on the 15th day. What's interesting is we call the 7-day holiday Pesach. But in the Torah, it's called Chag HaMatzot, the holiday of the Matzot. But the word Pesach appears in the Torah. Pesach is on the 14th day. The 14th day is when we would bring the Korban Pesach in preparation for eating it at the Seder on the 15th. So technically, Pesach means the 14th of Nisan, and the holiday of what we call Pesach is called Chag HaMatzot. So that's what it says here, that on the 14th day they made Pesach, meaning they prepared the Korban Pesach. And then God says to Yehoshua, because of the circumcision, he said, God says to him, now I've taken away the foreskin of Egypt away from you. In other words, this is part of the whole transition, not only crossing the Jordan from outside of Israel to in Israel, but the whole time that they were not circumcised, it was as if they still had a connection to Egypt. And so here God says, today I've taken away the foreskin of Egypt from you. And it says, and they ate matzah on that day. And then it says, listen to this, and it says, Vayishbot haman mimacharat be'achlam me avur ha'oretz v'lo ha'ya'od lebnei Yisrael man. So on the 16th of Nisan, the man stopped. On the 15th, they ate matzah. And the 16th already, there was no more man. It was finished. It was done. Now they're in Eretz Yisrael. It's a different reality. It's a whole completely different reality. Now, the 5th chapter, and this is where we're going to stop tonight, ends with a very mysterious incident here. So I'll read it in Hebrew. Vayihi b'yot Yehoshua b'Yericho. when Yehoshua, again, they're camped right across from Jericho. And in the previous verse, which I didn't mention, is on the 10th of Nisan, when they crossed the Jordan, well, just like we sent spies to Jericho, they had their spies. So they knew what it was reported. It got word passed very quickly that God had made this tremendous miracle and Israel was now in the land. And so a previous verse says that Jericho was locked down. No one came in and no one came out. And it says that like the fear of Israel fell upon all of the nations. So here they're about, we're not going to get to it this week. That will be for next week, the whole story of Jericho. But here it ends with saying that Yehoshua was by Jericho, v'yisainav v'yar hine ish omed lenegdo. And let's say he's looking in a certain direction, and all of a sudden a man appears. Just like he didn't see him before, just appears. The charbo shlufa b'yado, and he had a turning sword in his hand. V'yalech Yehoshua alav v'yomer lo. So Yehoshua went up to him and said, Halanu ata im l'tzari, are you for us or against us? In other words, he didn't quite understand what was happening here. He began to understand, like, it can't be a regular man, because I was just looking here and he just appeared. He looks like a man, but he must be an angel. And is this the sword, are you for us or against us? That's what he asks him. V'yomer lo, ki ani sar tzava Hashem. So he answered him, I am a prince of the host of God. Ata bati, and only now did I appear to you. Vayipol Yehoshua al panav artza v'yishtachavu yamar lo ma adoni medaber el avdo. And Yehoshua fell on his face, and he said to him, like, what do you want from me? Why are you here? What do you have to tell me? And so the Vayomer Sar Tzava Hashem El Yehoshua, Shal Nalcha Me'al Raglecha, Ki Hamakom Asher Ata Umed Alav Kodesh Hu, V'yas Yehoshua Kain. And so the angel says to Yehoshua, take the shoes off your feet, because the place that you are standing is holy. 1 second. And Yehoshua did so. And the next verse, that's the one I just talked about. V'yericho sogeret u'mesugeret mipnei b'nei Yisrael, ein yotzei v'ein ba. And now it jumps, and Jericho was shut down. No one came in and no one came out. So the mysterious thing is, what did he tell him? Here we have this angel comes. He has a sword, and he establishes that he's a representative of God, and that Yehoshua has to take off his shoes because he's in a holy place. But it doesn't tell us, well, what happened? And for that, we're dependent on the oral tradition. But before I say quickly, this should sound familiar to everyone. What happened when Moshe, he saw this burning bush, and he was amazed because it wasn't consumed. And so it said he turned to look, and when he did, God appeared, and the first thing he said to him is, take off your shoes, because the place that you're standing is holy. And so the Mamloes explains is that the Shekhinah was there with this angel. It wasn't just the angel. The divine presence was there, and that's what happened with Moshe at the burning bush. It was the presence of God. And the symbolism of, what's the symbolism? Take off your shoes. So we're told that shoes, and this is connected to why in Yom Kippur, we're told that one of the 5 forbidden acts is we don't wear leather shoes. Shoes represent a physicality. It's what we walk, comfort, especially leather shoes. In ancient times, leather shoes was like the height of wealth and status. And so taking off your shoes is almost like saying, divorce yourself from your physical reality, because you're in the presence of the Shekhinah. And so in order to receive the Shekhinah, you have to, in a certain way, transcend your whole bodily reality in order to receive that vision. So then there's different ideas. Well, who was this angel exactly? One opinion is it was Michael, the archangel Michael, and others say it was even a higher angel called Metatron. And he was actually considered the head of all of the angels, was Metatron. So then, and we'll end with this. So remember, Yeshua says, what's this? Why did you come? Why do you have a sword? What are you trying to tell me? Are you for us or against us? Did we do something wrong? So the answer is, like so many things in Judaism, it's like paradoxical that there were, in a sense, there's 2 sides to the sword. In one side, he came to encourage Yehoshua that the conquest of Eretz Yisrael is about to begin. And so I'm coming to assure you of God's help in conquering Eretz Yisrael. So that's the positive thing of the sword. The negative thing, the oral tradition says that the angel came and very subtly gave Yeshua a rebuke for a few things that he had done wrong. What did he do wrong? Is after they crossed the Jordan, they didn't learn Torah that night. They felt like, whoa, just this incredible miracle just happened, and we're setting up these stones, and it's almost time for Pesach. And people forgot about being involved in Torah. And if you remember, all the way back in the first chapter, when God tells Yeshua, I will be with you, but make sure that the words of Torah never leave your lips, and be involved in Torah Yom V'Layla. If you remember, that's in the first chapter. And so here the angel was saying, you kind of forgot about that. The other interesting thing is, and this gets to a question that we had last week, and here we can answer it somewhat, is Yehoshua didn't put the ark back into the Holy of Holies where it was kept. They were on the move, but he left it out. And the tradition is that if the ark is not in its place, then it's forbidden for husbands and wives to be together intimately. And so the angel came and said, you didn't put the ark back, and therefore you nullified the mitzvah of being fruitful and to expand and have children, be fruitful and multiply. So this was like the subtle rebuke to Yehoshua. So here, the question last week, I think it was Amy asked, was Yehoshua married? Because here we gave over this whole thing that Yehoshua, according to tradition, married Rachav. But we also learned that Yehoshua was either, I believe, 83 or 97, and he wasn't married yet. So the question was, well, maybe he was married. Maybe his wife died. Maybe Rachav was his second wife. And so there's different ideas, but the majority opinion is that Yehoshua was not married until he married Rachav. Or we simply don't know, because a wife and children are never mentioned from Yehoshua, even though in the oral tradition, if you remember last week, we learned that from Rachav and Yehoshua came 8 high priests, and a number of prophets, including Jeremiah, came from Yehoshua and Rachav. But here, this is what's interesting and makes it that we don't know for sure. When the angel said, not only have you nullified, be fruitful and multiply for all of Israel, but you only have daughters and you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of being fruitful and multiply, because according to the sages, the minimum is 1 son and 1 daughter. And he only had daughters. So the question is, well, where do you see he had daughters? He must have been married. And yet there's no mention of a wife or children, even in the book of Yehoshua, except way on, it mentions that when Yehoshua is preparing to die, he prepared his household. Now, this could be his household with Rachav. And this could be, like we said before, there's no necessarily before and after in the Torah. So it could have been that the daughters came later. It could have been that they came before. It could have been that he was married before. It could be that he wasn't married before. There's no definitive answer. But the one thing is clear is that, according to almost everyone, he married Rachav, and he had this lineage that ended up being high priests and prophets. So with that, we end the 5th chapter.